You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Christopher Media, let's make some noise.
Aurora and Don Bluth Productions present a classic adventure in motion picture entertainment. I must tell you about NIMH. Look there. It's a fantasy with wizards and villains. And heroes.
I ain't scared of nothing. I'm not even afraid of the Great Owl.
Will you hush up? Come on.
It's an odyssey to another world. A world of fantasy and enchantment.
To what you see and hear, you must swear absolute secrecy.
It's the most beautiful sight I've ever seen.
You like me?
Of course I like you.
It's a story of friendship.
I mean, you don't think I'm clumsy or anything. What? I just need a few pointers to polish my style. I told you you'd love flying.
I don't know how I let you talk me into this.
It's a classic story of courage.
Why have you come?
And a world of danger.
If I had actually been near a cat, I'd be sneezing my brains out. I'm allergic to... Hey. Excuse me, pardon me.
Get out from your life!
Where courage is rewarded.
Oh, thank you.
A motion picture for everyone to share.
Oh, the poor turkey fell down.
I'm not a turkey.
Big
No,
buzzard,
stop.
where's our mother? Get down with her, you better jump.
Discover the secret of NIMH and rediscover the child in us all.
Welcome to the Projection Booth. I'm your host, Mike White. Joining me once again, S. El Goro.
I'll be right with you, Mike. I'm just all tangled up in this string.
Also back in the booth is Ms. Kat Ellinger.
Hello.
This week we are discussing the 1982 film from director Don Bluth, The Secret of NIMH, based on the book by Richard C. O'Brien. This is an animated tale of Mrs. Frisby. Frisby, right? No, Brisby. It's Brisby in this version. The widow with several children, one of whom is very sick and cannot be moved. This is a problem as the Brisby family needs to move due to the impending plowing of their home. That's the really simplistic summary of this film, which we will proceed to ruin if you haven't seen it yet. So be warned. So, Kat, when was the first time you saw The Secret of NIMH, and what did you think?
That I have all these extremes when I come on this show, so it's either within the last 5 years via second run, this middle part where I don't remember, or one of the first films I ever saw. So this falls into one of the first films I ever saw at the cinema, and I loved this film at the time. I thought it was so magical and dark as well. Obviously, bits of it were scary.
I can definitely see that. El Goro, how about you?
I would have seen this when I was around 3 years old or so, during that time when parents would just say, hey, it's a cartoon, it must be appropriate for kids. And while The Secret of NIMH definitely isn't on the harder end, it's not like, say, Plague Dogs, which also came out in 1982, it certainly is a shade or two darker than standard Disney fare that was available to me as a child. And as such, it left an indelible impression on me.
I saw this at the movie theater when I was, around fourth grade, I think this was. My folks owned a small business, and there was a movie theater right across the street. So in order to get me out of their hair, they would send me across the street to see movies. And so I saw this one repeatedly at the Showboat Theater.
Don't look for it. It's not there anymore.
This movie, magical, dark, compelling, and it sticks with me. I mean, this movie has been part of my life since '82, and it's one of those rare animated films that I actually go back and will seek out and rewatch again, once every 5 years or so. But it brings back a lot of good memories, and still just, my God, the look of this film is just amazing.
Oh yeah, absolutely gorgeous. And there's something so quintessentially 1980s about it. And that's not necessarily a knock against it. It's just some of the animation techniques that were utilized by Don Bluth and his production company. They became almost a standard that you can find replete throughout 1980s animation. Yet for some reason, perhaps in the shift towards computer generated imagery, even within classically animated films, they sort of moved away from some of these techniques, perhaps due to the labor intensive nature of them. But there's something just so beautifully timeless about some of the sequences within this film.
It's definitely as magical as I remembered it, because I haven't seen it for so many years. I think I was about 8. I must have been about 7 or 8 when I first saw it. And there's definitely something about it. It doesn't look like the Disney films of that period. I just remember when I first saw it, how vivid I thought it was, all the little sparkly bits, and just how magical it looked. And it's definitely not lost that.
The sparkly bits, as you so eloquently put it, that it just always takes me back watching this. And now watching it again, so many years later, I'm watching it a little bit more critically. I'm reading articles about it and seeing people with really weird complaints about the movie. I'm just like, well, this doesn't add up plot-wise. I'm like, oh, really? Are we going to go there?
As a kid, you don't think about those sorts of things. You watch it now and you're just like, the rats have magic. All right.
See, I'm like Jeremy. I just like sparkly things. Anyway, I've never given it that much thought, to be honest.
A couple weeks ago, Kat, we talked about Belladonna Sadness, another animated film. And wow, talk about two really different films on the surface, but then the whole idea of female empowerment is also in this movie, which watching it again now, I'm like, oh wow, this movie was kind of ahead of its time. Like actually having a widowed woman as the protagonist of this film who needs to take care of her family and she'll go to any lengths in order to do it. And that she's the hero of the story is, wow, pretty remarkable. But then at the same time, I'm like, but did she really need to use magic, or is that just a stand-in for like her inner character development at that point?
But she's the only one who can use that magic, though, because no one else can use the stone, can they? So I think that's true. It becomes like a metaphor for her inner strength, which I love. Yep. I love that part of it.
And I think I read somewhere that that was intentional on Bluth's part, that they needed a visual representation of that sort of arc, that sort of inner strength within her. And they said, hey, we're working in animation. Animation is inherently magic. Let's just throw magic in there.
And, Nicodemus, he's got the magic. He can write words with the pen kind of hovering above them. I mean, just that opening sequence of Nicodemus giving this voiceover about Jonathan Frisbee was killed today. It's just like, and by the way, I'm going to fuck up constantly and say Frisbee instead of Brisby. So please forgive me, guys. And for the listeners at home, it was Frisbee in the book and it was Brisby in the movie. So I'm kind of confusing the two. So thanks, Whammo, for ruining that for me.
I guess we could just call her Elizabeth Hartman, I guess.
Jonathan is such a major character, but we only see him in flashbacks. And he's kind of also a key. I mean, we talked about how the amulet is a key. He's kind of a key for her to open up a lot of doors. Like, things change when she drops his name because he has such a huge reputation.
Yeah, which is interesting to me, the fact that we do know so little about him, and yet his presence is throughout the entire film. I mean, it's almost like the character of Timmy, that we see him in the beginning, he delivers one line of dialogue near the end, but otherwise it's just something that exists in the background to inform the plot or to drive it forward. Now, sadly, we would unfortunately spend way more time with Timmy in the sequel, but I'm sure we'll get to that execrable piece of crap later.
I'm never going to forgive you guys for making me sit through that.
You were warned. I distinctly remember warning both of you that you shouldn't watch that film.
Boy, you were trying to take one for the team with us, and we wouldn't listen.
Yeah, but then Mike's like, oh, well, we should watch it anyway, so we can talk about it. Worse than I ever imagined. It was an exaggeration that it was actually bad.
Yeah, I don't know if I could have taken your word for it had I not witnessed it with mine own eyes.
Well, hopefully we will successfully warn people off it now, but I have a feeling there's just the movie world is filled with people that just want to see, and unfortunately it doesn't end well.
Timmy is the motivating factor for this, as well as that we're about at harvest time. So she needs to get Timmy well. Timmy's not in the well, but she needs to get him well. And then she also needs to worry about her house and either moving her house or moving to a new house because it's just about time for the plow to happen. So she's got these two ticking clocks kind of going on that she really needs to worry about. And then that puts her in motion for the rest of this movie. And then it is basically like, okay, I'm going to visit Mr. Ages and I'm going to try to get some medicine. I'm going to find out some advice. I'm going to talk with Andy Shrew. And it's just like everybody is a part of this, moving the story ahead, trying to get her to, her eventual goal. And I like that she's this investigator type of character who's going through all of these things. She's taking that hero's journey. But then we also have us as the audience going, what the hell's going on here? Like, what is NIMH? Like, they mentioned it at one point. That's the National Institute of Mental Health. What is this? How do these rats have electricity? What's going on? But then it's also interesting because we're put into a world of animated animals, which is a very familiar place for us to be. I mean, we just saw The Rescuers a few years before this, possibly, but we know cartoon mice. We've seen cartoon mice all of our lives. So it's like, okay, we're kind of familiar with this, but then that they actually use this whole idea of, no, we are super smart mice. And now we have to question, well, they're mice and rats. Now we have to question, well, why is that? And what happened to these rats and mice?
And from a narrative standpoint, they do a good thing by refocusing the story to make Mrs. Brisby the central character. Because I don't know if you guys have read the original novel, but there was a greater emphasis upon the rats within the original Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of NIMH. But by changing it and actually putting the story on Mrs. In this case, Brisby, and also changing her entire arc so everything cycles around her, I think it really helps streamline the narrative and making it more palatable towards the intended audience, which of course was children at this time.
Can I just say, the whole moving thing, the whole thing about them having to move is really Watership Down, though, don't you think?
Oh, sure.
And this whole thing about the animals versus the humans, and the humans sort of being these figures in the background that are destructive. I mean, Watership Down was another film I saw around that period, which just... That one completely damaged me, though, because it's just so dark and so sad. But yeah, there's definitely some sort of connection there. And there was the plague dogs around that time as well.
Oh, I still have flashbacks of plague dogs.
Downbeat than this. So they soften the edges on this one, but it's still quite dark. The fact that she's widowed, the fact that she's looking after these children on her own, and the whole backstory about the experimentation, those scenes, even the scenes with the owl, I found really frightening when I was a kid. But frightening in a good way, like compelling.
Well, it's interesting that you brought up Watership Down, because I also went into this thinking, it's like, okay, this story is very much in the tradition of that Richard Adams novel. And then it was surprising to me to look it up in preparation for this show that the novel Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of NIMH, it actually predates Watership Down by a year. So that Mrs. Frisbee came out in 71 and Watership Down came out in 72.
There seemed to be a big thing in that period where you had these kind of eco narratives with the animals. Like when it gets to the 90s, the animals are just these, well, when it gets to Secret of NIMH 2, the animals are just these kind of cute figures who exist in their own universe. But you did have a lot of this stuff in the late 70s, early 80s that were very tuned into this sort of ecological message of what are we doing to our planet, and we're harming the animals, and, these sort of narratives. So it does kind of squeeze into that, although you don't see a lot of the NIMH people until you get to the second one, and then you've got that Dr. Valentine.
And what was it in the 1970s, do you guys think, that sort of led to these sort of eco-narratives? I mean, because of course we have Watership Down and we have Mrs. Frisbee, but then you can even look at something like Silent Running that also is replete with that kind of messaging. What was it in the 70s that kind of formed the basis for these sorts of stories?
I think people were just becoming more aware at that point. We were starting to hear about global warming, weren't we? People were becoming more conscious of what we were doing to the environment. I don't know. It just seemed to be a shift in consciousness that then got dumbed down by the 90s. That message sort of lost. But there was, like, Silent Running was another one. I saw that as a kid. All I knew was the robots. Like, I had to run up to my room when it finished and just was sobbing. The final shot of the film. And I didn't really understand much apart from the robots. And I saw it as an adult and I thought, Jesus Christ, this film is transgressive. It's just really out there. It's a brilliant film, but yeah, you did have a lot. Even E.T. had a kind of similar message as well.
I mean, I don't know if Rachel Carson kicked off the ecological narrative that was going on with her book Silent Spring in 1962, but I think that played a part. I mean, if you go back and you look at like photos before the idea of, the Iron Eyes Cody, with the crying Indian on the side of the road looking at all the pollution. I mean, that's the kind of world that we grew up in, was like, hey, give a hoot, don't pollute kind of thing. But before that, I mean, you can see photos of just like, it's almost as bad as it is today with all of the plastic in the ocean and all these things. But it's like, oh yeah, putting chemicals in the water. I mean, Joni Mitchell's even singing about leave me spots on my apples, but leave me the birds and the bees. And it's just like, okay, yeah, it's everywhere at this point. And I think that helped kick off too. You're talking about Silent Running. And I think all of like the nature gone wild, like the bees and the spiders and the snakes and, the rabbits.
But bees, everything. I was like terrified of everything. You also had the nuclear thing going on in the background as well. It was a scary time to live. There was that guy who wrote that article, bit of a tangent here, about how he'd seen heathers at 24. I'm 24 years old and I've just seen heathers, and he was going on about how terrible it was and how, obviously now in the millennium, young people have a lot more things to worry about. And it's like, dude, you didn't grow up in the 80s. If the bees were going to get you, or or you were going to get a bomb dropped on you, or you were going to get poisoned by the water, you had those public information films. It was a terrifying time. Even the kids' cartoons were covering things like death and animal cruelty and all these experimentation. It was a scarier time, I think, then.
And I want to say that the book Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH, it was inspired by the whole idea of the laboratory tests on animals, and there was a series of articles around, I want to say late 60s possibly, that really shed light on what was going on with that. Now, that would continue for years and years and years, but at least there was starting to be discussion about that. And then I've read recently that some of that stuff is starting to happen again. So it's like, great. Thanks again. So now we need to have like another round of this kind of stuff, I guess, to tell us how horrible it is to put lipstick on like rabbit eyes and all of these horrible things that they were doing.
Yeah, except if you were to do it now, there would be a horde of people on the internet claiming it was all SJW propaganda. And why can't we go back to the cartoons when we were kids that clearly didn't have a political messaging? Because political messaging in child's entertainment is something that's clearly only a byproduct of the 21st century, right? Right?
I don't know. I'm enjoying all the bro talk today.
Are we being bros about this? We haven't even talked about how sexy Mrs. Frisby is. Ooh.
Oh, God, please no. I swear this film launched an entire generation of furries.
Yeah, there was somebody going on about the how the crows are into bondage. I was like, what are you even talking about? And I was like, oh, yeah, they're tied up with string at the end? What? What is your problem?
You missed that message when I was 8 years old.
I missed it now at 47.
I guess fetishes are formed in our formative years, and maybe I could see how that could affect somebody, but it's a cartoon crow, guys. Come on. It's Dom DeLuise, and personally, I don't want to imagine Dom DeLuise in a sexual situation.
Not even as Captain Chaos.
Exactly. I have nothing but love for the man, but imagining him having sex is just, let alone in a bondage situation.
I just hear him with that laugh, that...
That's actually one thing I wanted to mention, because Dom DeLuise at this point by the time that I became, aware of his work, he was tied very much into the world of animation because he did a lot of work in that particular medium. And this was actually one of his earliest voice acting roles. I found one prior to this, which was a English localization of a Swedish cartoon called Peter No Tail. But Secret of NIMH was, for all intents and purposes, his big break into animation. But then you look at what he did after that, and it's just all of these voice acting credits. And they were all right in the time when I was coming of age. So I've always associated him with his animated roles more so than his live action roles.
Yeah, from what I understand, it was kind of that almost like Robin Williams as the genie kind of thing. Like, hey, I can do this and I can do this. And he would just like riff a bit and go from there. And the guys at Bluth Animation were like, great. Yeah, keep it. And I think that's how he got that expanded role, because Jeremy the Crow, he's barely in Mrs. Frisby, but he is all over the place in Secret of NIMH.
He's great though. I loved him as a kid. He was like my favourite character.
Yeah, now there's like maybe one scene too many of Jeremy where I'm just like, but at least like Mrs. Brisby knows that he's a pain in the ass.
On the topic of the voice acting cast in this, I had no idea just how stacked this film is in terms of talent.
Aldo fucking Raid.
Right? Which it's a name that would have meant nothing to me as a kid, and now it's Aldo Ray's in this movie?
Shannon Doherty as well.
I was just going to say that. Shannon Doherty and Will Wheaton are in this film. I mean, you wouldn't recognize their voices because they were very young at this point, but good Lord. And then you have Derek Jacobi and John Carradine, the aforementioned Elizabeth Hartman. This voice cast is just incredibly stacked.
And speaking of stacked, Elizabeth Hartman, no, I'm just kidding.
There's that bro tendency.
Go and bro it alone, you two. I'll just sit in the background.
I said nothing. I was talking about Dom DeLuise.
Elizabeth Hartman is just amazing in here. I love her voice. I love the emotion that she brings to her performance. Really striking. I had no idea that this was her last role. She would end up committing suicide a couple years later. And it's super heartbreaking because she was so good in this film. Brilliant.
There's a sort of frailty to the voice, but also this strength as well. It's just so nuanced. Far more nuance than you see in a lot of animated films. There's just a lot of... I remember really responding to the Mrs. Brisby character when I was a kid.
Normally, her approach that she utilized for her voice acting doesn't always work for me. And it's something I've spoken to in the past, that when you cast somebody in a voice role who is not trained in that particular thing, sometimes you can end up with mixed results, and sometimes you have a tendency towards understatement. And it doesn't always work very well in animation, which almost demands a showier approach to one's voice.
They generally have a lot more dramatic, animated voices are a lot more dramatic, aren't they? But Mrs. Brisby's voice in this is, I don't know, there's like a vulnerability about it.
Yeah, and it's funny that it actually ends up working so well, because a lot of times, in my opinion, the understated approach in animation just comes off as flat. But with her, we do hear that vulnerability, and we do hear that undercurrent of strength. And perhaps it's just that wonderful alchemy between the very detailed character animation they were able to do with her and her own qualities as a voice actress. It ends up becoming a very compelling character that manages to be understated without becoming flat.
And I wonder how much of that is her. Like, when it comes to the character design, I wonder how much they based on her. Because I know when it comes to the owl, there are things that they did where they modeled it directly off of John Carradine. Like the way that he walks with a limp, and they took that right from John Carradine's walk, because he had really horrific arthritis at this point and had a hard time getting around. And apparently he did his whole performance in just one shot, and that was it, which is just remarkable to me.
Oh, that's amazing. I also love the fact that we were talking about the disparity between the names of Frisbee versus Brisby, and apparently they found out they couldn't use the Frisbee name relatively late in the production, requiring them to go back and re-record things. But John Carradine wasn't available, so they actually had to re-edit his audio, sampling F or B sounds from previous parts in order to overlay the F sound he was making when he was saying Frisbee. So when he says Mrs. Jonathan Brisby, that's a result of audio editing, not actual performance.
I listened for that so closely because I had read this same story and I was just like, I don't hear it. I could not make out that was an overdub whatsoever. It was brilliant.
Yeah, props to whoever did the audio engineering on that, because it is remarkably difficult to do that sort of thing, but they did a great job there.
Yeah, I mean, taking out a syllable or something is relatively easy, but yeah, to get that explosive B, over the F sound, yeah, that was really good.
I noticed you got a note, actually, Mike, about the owl not really being much. It adds nothing to the story.
Well, it's interesting, yeah, because she goes and sees him, and he pretty much just tells her, like, move the house to the lee of the stone, and that's about it. And I was thinking, like, well, does it really...
When you're 8 years old and he's up on a big screen, that's what he adds to the story.
More than that, she kind of uses him as a key as well to say, listen, I talked to the owl and he said this. And then when people hear, oh, Mrs. Brisby went and talked to the owl, that's a baller move. That's also an entree into things where it's just like, well, I talked to the owl, and it's like, what? You talked to the owl? Whoa, okay. You mean business here. You are not just, coming in and trying to use your husband's name as cachet or anything. It's like, you really mean business, lady.
I can see while some people can make the argument that from a narrative utility standpoint, the owl adds nothing, because Nicodemus, who also is patterned very closely off of the owl, they're very similarly animated. He clearly knows the problem she's in. He knows the solution to it without her even having to say the whole advice to move the house to the lee of the stone. He just knows. But the importance of that particular scene is to show her facing the unknown, showing the inherent courage within her. It's that whole Joseph Campbell crossing of the threshold moment. We get that when she goes into the lair of the great owl. Plus, it's just a beautifully animated sequence, and I wouldn't lose it for the world.
Yeah, that whole idea of the cave and what the cave represents, and just that we see the literal cave as well in something like Empire Strikes Back, where it's just like, okay, you have to enter that cave. So yeah, I'm glad you brought up Joseph Campbell, because I kept thinking of him as I was watching her hero's journey throughout this. And as soon as she went into that, and I know it's not a literal cave, but it pretty much is that place that he's in the tree, where it's just like, wow, okay, she's going in there, she's doing this, and we've got that great fake out with the spider where we think that she's going to get attacked by the spider. That great sound effect of his foot or claw, I guess it would be talon, coming down on the spider and squishing it. I mean, just the sound work itself. We talked about the Brisby versus Frisbee, but the sound effects and stuff, just such a terrific job.
And one thing that struck me as I was watching this, I was trying to unpack why this film would have unsettled me as a child. And I think one thing that does contribute to that is that while it does have a fantastic score with some very stirring movements from Jerry Goldsmith, there are certain passages of this film that are unaccompanied by music. And it's a small thing, but when you're a child, if you look back at the majority of children's animation, whether you go back to old Tom and Jerry cartoons or Looney Tunes or anything like that, they're almost wall to wall filled with sound. And that helps give a child an emotional cue. If the music is light, we feel at ease. If the music is ominous, we're guided towards that feeling. If you remove the score, for a young child, it's up to them to determine what it is meant to be. And for somebody who's just coming to terms with what emotions are and how the proper way to think and feel, that can be a rather relatively unsettling prospect. And I think that works to the benefit of this film.
I hadn't really noticed that. It's a really interesting observation. You're right, though. And obviously that's where they went wrong in part 2. Fucking song for everything.
Whilst there is a song in Secret of NIMH, none of the cast are actually singing it. You know, it's in the background. It's non-diegetic or what have you. I'm not up on my film terms, but
She doesn't sing that to Timmy?
But we don't see her mouth moving, so I guess she's not singing it.
Okay, so she's like singing it. Yeah, and I also appreciate that the character design on the first rat that she meets, like that rat looks so different than any of the others. So it's like we're seeing it through her POV, because after that we'll see like Justin and some of these other rats where it's like, okay, they look much more anthropomorphic. But that first rat that we see, Brutus, I think his name is, and he's got that electrified spear and he's pretty much just trying to kill her. And he has that, at that point, he has no eyes. It's like little silver globes instead of where his eyes are. He's super scary.
It is really horrifying. I was trying to think back to when I was a kid. I remember I was really enthralled with the film, even the darker parts, but I was just glued to my seat in those parts. There's something really sinister about those, just the way that rat is with the eyes, and it was just something really, and the owl as well.
And that's actually something that was a unique contribution to the film that was pointed out by a friend of mine when I commented that I was coming on the show to discuss this, that the whole medieval weaponry of the rats, that wasn't present within the original novel. That was something that was added to the film. But it's just so evocative, the idea that they have this pseudo-medieval society, that they will have a conflict resolved with a sword fight at the end. I absolutely love that.
It gets like really all this power struggle and everything. It just completely changes track to have, like, when you've got this conflict between the rats and, you know, not wanting to move and trying to bump off Nicodemus. And it gets very Shakespearean. And then they've got all these weapons going on and stuff. It's great.
And it also fits into that environmental message that we were talking about. The idea that there is one faction that wants to have a sustainable society, one where they're not required to steal the resources they need in order to survive. And then the others that are quite content to do that believe that they are entitled to have access to these sorts of things and that they can take on the world and fight the humans of all things. They're leading the entire colony to devastation because they don't believe in the need to create a sustainable world.
Which is great. I didn't, as an 8-year-old, I didn't note that message. But watching it back, I was like, this is actually really kind of still applicable now. When you look at how we are, this fact that they don't want to be living off the humans. And like you said, they're trying to create this sustainable community. It's just so far out for a kid's cartoon.
Now, if only we can get our politicians to resolve their conflicts with a sword fight.
We need to send them to NIMH.
Yeah, I think getting injected with something that raises intelligence, that wouldn't be too bad. I want to talk about Jenner for a few minutes, because Jenner is just talked about in Mrs. Frisby, the book, and he's not seen. He had a break with Nicodemus and this whole idea of, you know, the sustainable versus the non-sustainable, but he's not really made out to be a villain. But he is a great villain when it comes to the movie. And they just pretty much, I don't want to say conjured him up, because like I said, he was there, but he was there in such a different capacity. And he was definitely not present going head to head against, you know, Justin and kind of chewing the scenery, but in a great way. I really like this character.
His expanded role certainly reflects, Bluth's experience being a Disney animator. Because one thing that Disney can be called upon for is the great villain characters and the narrative necessity for that villain. You know, the children want to have a bad guy. The externalization of all the struggles that the people are going towards. And the fact that he's voiced by Paul Shinar, the goddamn Sosa from Scarface, that just makes it even better.
He is great. I mean, you're right. Even in Watership Down, they've got that other Warren, haven't they? Where they're like the humans in that are very much in the background as well. There's a sort of a more subtextual villain. They're not strong enough for a kid to identify with. Because when you're 6 or 7 or 8, you want the sword fight and you want the bad guy and you want all that in with your ecological messages.
when we talk about the sort of abstract threat that the humans represent, that initially they were a very abstract menace, even down to how they were animated. The first time we see Farmer Fitzgibbons, he is on his tractor and he's rotoscoped, which is definitely a different animation style than the rest of the characters. What's curious to me is that they didn't continue with that technique later on, and then later when we see the humans, they're more traditionally animated. And I almost wonder if they had avoided that tendency, if they hadn't shown us clearly the people, or if we had seen them, they were this sort of rotoscoped animated figure, that if perhaps it would have been a stronger artistic statement on behalf of the film.
I was just trying to think of the whole idea of who Jeremy reminds me of, because, Kat, I think you said that this film gets almost into like a Shakespeare territory here. He reminded me a little bit of Koba from the new Planet of the Apes film, where they're trying to start their new society, but he is so damaged by what the humans had done to him that he will do anything to ruin everything, basically just to get back at the humans. Now, Jeremy isn't necessarily exactly like that, but he is that bad seed that pretty much just, what's his line? Like, I take what I want when I want. So he doesn't care about any of this idea of, I'm going to be a good player amongst the team. I am the center of the world, basically.
Yeah, it was Jenner, right?
Jenner. Sorry. Who did I say?
Jeremy, which all of a sudden that I really wanted to see Dom DeLuise play a villain.
Well, I do have to complain that we got Justin, Jeremy, and Jenner, and it's just like, come on, guys. Can we think of some different names? Maybe a different letter?
And Jonathan.
Oh,
a lot of J's.
That must have some meaning. There must be some meaning for that. Unless they just had a book open of names and they were like, flick to a page. Okay, Jonathan, Jeremy, Justin, Jenna.
Nicodemus. That one rolls off the tongue.
Who knows? Maybe Robert C. O'Brien just had 4 sons and they went with the alliterative names thing.
Well, at least he did better than George Foreman and just named all the characters George. It'd be like Wuthering Heights all over again.
Though, I actually, one thing I wanted to call back to when we were talking about the quality of the animation, and we were talking about that, the sparkly animation. I love how that particular technique was utilized back in the day, where it was them using a light box. So they put the cell over it. They would carve off little bits of it of the cell with a knife. So the light behind would shine through the cell in these parts to give you that light up thing. I think it was similar to the technique they utilized in Tron to pull off that. I adore how that looks. And as I said, it's a very labor-intensive process, and you can understand why it kind of fell out of favor as digital techniques were able to kind of approximate that look. But there's just something so beautiful when it was realized back in the 1980s, in particular in The Secret of NIMH. I'm not sure if they originated that particular technique, but that was certainly one of the best exemplars of it. And we saw various people utilize it throughout the rest of the 1980s, whether it be in America or Japan.
It looks incredible. I remember thinking before I went back into it, I remember this film being so sparkly and wondering if that was just something that was in my imagination and it would look shit now. No, it doesn't. It looks, I didn't read into the technique, obviously. It makes sense now, having it explained, but looking at it, it was just like, wow, this is really something else.
When you guys watched the movie, did you watch this on a restored copy on Blu-ray or anything? Because I watched this streaming on Amazon Prime, and there were certainly parts where it looked like the cells were a bit dirty. I don't know if they've ever done a proper restoration on this film.
No, I didn't see a Blu-ray version, just DVD.
Okay.
I did watch it on Blu-ray. There was a German release of it on Blu-ray that I got through Diabolic DVD. It's a region B, but luckily my player supports that. And it's got audio commentary. It's got a little making of documentary on there. There's some trailers, those kind of things. But yeah, the audio commentary is fascinating, and especially because they're watching a version that isn't as good as the version that was on the Blu-ray. So they kept saying like, oh yeah, well, this looks really bad here, but it'll be cleaned up for the DVD release. And I was like, oh, okay.
Fair enough.
They're talking about, how red bleeds out and stuff, and how they didn't want to use red a lot because of, NTSC and video cassettes and stuff. And then when it came to the DVD, they're just like, oh yeah, no, this should be all good to go. And did you fix that cape? You notice how her cape changes color? And they're just like, this is really picking it apart, because of course this is Gary Goldman and Don Bluth talking about this. So just all of that and all the inside baseball kind of stuff that they're talking about, and like they're talking about the lamp that lowers them down, I think, inside of the rat's nest, and that was just a lamp that Bluth found in the garbage and cleaned up, and then like took all these photographs of it, made all these references of it, and now it's like in a museum in France. And he's just like, oh, that cute little lamp made this whole journey from a garbage pile to a museum.
I have to track down that release because, as I mentioned, I'm something of an animation geek, so the opportunity to hear Don Bluth speak to that would be very fascinating to me.
I actually got 2 accidentally, so I will send you one of those.
Oh, thank you, sir.
You're welcome. I will not send you my DVD copy of Secret of NIMH 2, though, even though I know how badly you want it.
I think we still have a VHS copy of it floating around my parents' house.
Oh, you got to upgrade, because that just looks so beautiful on DVD.
Oh,
the resolution.
I feel like a good parent, because it was totally new to me, and obviously when it came out, my kids were younger, and so we were into all the animated films, and that was one that passed us by, thankfully. Quite smug about that I hadn't subjected them to that, although it wouldn't have rolled with them.
How it came to me is that my brother was born 10 years after me. So when he was coming up, we still had all of the animated films from when my sister and I were children. And I took a certain kind of glee of showing my very younger brother, who was probably about 3 years old, the films that I liked when I was a kid. So, I would show him a lot of these darker animated films from the 1980s, stuff like The Secret of NIMH, stuff like Land Before Time, stuff like American Tail. And to a film, which again, if you go back and look at those original ones, they were very dark. They were very meticulously animated, but they were still kid-friendly. What followed with all of those were a series of direct-to-video sequels, though I think the first sequel to American Tail may have had a theatrical release, Five-O Goes West.
Yes, it did.
That did get a theatrical. And so the quality was higher on that. But so many of these animated films from the 1980s, they just kind of went crazy with these direct-to-video sequels on them. And they really lost a lot of the artistry that so typified these original films. They became just kind of disposable things. And in the sad case of Secret of NIMH and American Tail, Don Bluth films, they became the same kind of disposable stuff that led him to leave Disney in the first place and aspire to something more, which is why it is somewhat painful to me, because if you know the aspirations behind Don Bluth, if you know what he wanted to accomplish, to see his intellectual property morph into the very thing that he wanted to avoid, it's very sad.
Look, I wouldn't say morphed, I'd say desecrated.
There, we'll go with that.
Whenever it comes to any of those direct-to-video sequels, I can always hear, like, Mark Elliott, the voice of Disney trailers, just like,
The Lion King 2, Simba's Pride. The Circle of Life continues in an all-new sequel, only on video, October 27th.
He also made it sound so delightful that we were getting this shit on VHS.
Oh, God. Well, they have to move the product. And at the end of the day, everything becomes Disney.
I think you said before that the character design on Nicodemus is very similar to the owl, which was very intentional. And I love that both of them have those glowing eyes, which just make them look, again, so, I can't say inhuman, because they're not human, more otherworldly. And I think that really fits with Nicodemus and the connection to magic. And that so much of this movie, when we think about it, is actually him. I talked about how he's the voiceover at the beginning, but there are a couple times where we go to, and Kat reminded me of American Tiger, where we will see him looking through a glass and seeing things that are happening on screen. So he's like this observer / narrator through a lot of the film as well, at least at this beginning part, until we actually join up with him in the narrative.
I like the way you can just summon past events on a... he can be like, look at this, and he can just conjure up these things. That's a way to get the story moving and get some backstory in.
And it makes me wonder if that was always intended. I mean, because the role he plays at times with his narration and the cutting back to him is as the exposition dump. And he also provides, the background for Nim and all of these things. So I wonder if it was a decision late in the process to add him in as a narrator to perhaps streamline the story for the children.
It could be. I mean, though he does serve in that narrator context when it comes to the book. And I was just amazed going through and reading the book how much of it is the backstory. Like, we start off with Mrs. Brisby and go through her story. And then once she meets Nicodemus, I mean, he's got such a huge chunk of the book just telling all of the backstory of Nim to the point where they actually take breaks and go into other things. It's like, okay, Mr. Aegis and Justice, they're going to go out and get the stuff to make Dragon go to sleep. In the meantime, Nicodemus is going to tell you a little bit more about this whole story. Now he's going to tell you about the Tinkerer. Now he's going to tell you about this. And it's just like, wow, so much of this is all Nicodemus telling these stories of what happened at Nim and the long history. And it's interesting because it actually filled in a couple gaps that I always had wondered about. Like, well, how did they get to this place and how did this happen? And he actually gave me all that information. So thank you, Nicodemus. I do like this whole idea too of how they don't grow old, and that Jonathan kept a lot of this stuff from his wife because he was afraid that she was going to grow old and die while he still was young. And I was totally thinking of the Highlander at that point.
Such a sad move as well, wasn't it? It's just like, he's dead anyway, but they just add that in. There was so much. I mean, a lot of the sad moments aren't sentimental. They come from these little things that they add in that are really tragic. I mean, the thought that they were obviously very much in love, and then she would have gone on and he would have just been left. And, it's just introduced in this little sentence that's thrown in there. I love that fact. I love the fact it's not overly sentimental as well, talking to Disney.
That's one of the things that it felt like Bluth had enough faith in his audience, children though they were, that they would be sophisticated enough to pick up the messaging.
You tend to, or my own kids do. I mean, I just went to the cinema with my son, who's 12, to see Toy Story 4 and got the running commentary of all the plot holes and everything through.
Oh, no.
And I think if you force that sort of sentimentality on it, they know. I think people underestimate kids. That's definitely why it resonated with me as a kid more. And Watership Down really resonated with me, The Dark Crystal. I liked some Disney. I love The Fox and the Hound, but I used to find Disney too much as a kid.
I like that rather than killing the mother, that the mother is the main character here.
And she's got that wonderful strength as well, but it's not this... It's like we talked about, that sort of nuance, that frailty and vulnerability, but she's also the strongest character in it. It's such a... When I think about the other films that were being made at the time, you had Labyrinth a little bit later on, but it was mainly centred around male heroes, so I don't know if that was something that resonated with me as well. Just this real sense of female strength was quite different to a lot of the children's films that were being made. Like I mentioned E.T., that all revolves around E.T. and Elliot and boys, well, not boys films, but you know what I mean. So yeah, she's great, Mrs. Brisby.
Even beyond that, just the positioning of the protagonist as the parent, having an adult protagonist, it is somewhat a departure because a lot of children targeted animation or media will give us a child protagonist. You get that empathetic connection with the child audience and the child protagonist. And that's also feeds into why parents have a tendency to end up dead, because one of the worst things we can imagine as a child is the loss of our parent. And while this certainly does have an absentee parent, the positioning of it is also focused upon Mrs. Brisby, which is a departure from traditional children's stories. I think that's why in the less good sequel, it transitions to Timothy, that they wanted a more youthful protagonist, and it didn't work.
No, it doesn't work. The one thing I love mentioning the dead parent is the fact that they don't layer that on as well. They don't portray the kids as victims either. they don't really go for that sentimentality either. So it feels like emotionally very true. And I think that's wonderful. I think, despite the fact that she is a parent, even as a kid, you could relate to somebody who was just really struggling and trying and doing their best. So it didn't really matter, if she was a parent or a kid or whatever. The character's just so well formed and so well performed and so well animated that you just really invest in her. It doesn't matter.
The other thing I want to bring up is that the rats of NIMH and Mr. Aegis and Jonathan, they were all altered. And from what I understand, the kids are altered as well. They share some of Jonathan's new DNA, and they talk about that a lot more in the book as far as, are the children also intelligent? Do they also have these new abilities that the rats and these remaining 2 mice had? And the answer is yes. So Mrs. Brisby's kind of an outsider because she is, quote unquote, just a field mouse that Jonathan fell in love with. But yet she is elevated because she shouldn't have this intelligence that he had, but she learns how to read. She can understand this stuff. She's
smart as well, and the way she gets out of that cage.
Yeah, she's super smart.
I did wonder about the kids, though, so I'm glad because I did actually wonder about that when I was watching it yesterday. Have the children got some of this, whatever it is, this NIMH DNA? And so that's interesting they didn't bring that into the story, though. Or I guess it was superfluous, though. So it was more about her and her journey.
Well, they would have had to have drawn Punnett squares. It would have gotten really messy.
But I did that's interesting. No, I like that idea. But she's just as smart, and you wonder if it's because Jonathan... So there's talk of him teaching her to read and stuff. You wonder how much of that is her and how much Jonathan had a hand in it. But she's truly independent. She relies on the rats for help, but at the end it's her that saves everyone, which is just great.
She can read the back of the amulet. She can read other things. She reads what's happening in that book of Nicodemus's. So, yeah, the only sad thing to me is that, talking again about the aging thing, is that her kids are going to age a lot slower, and she's going to end up passing away before she even gets to see her kids grow up. But let's not think about that, I guess.
Yeah, that gets into some dark territory.
Very dark.
Best not acknowledged.
But yeah, the way that she figures out how to get out of that cage that she's caught in towards the end, that scene is very disturbing to me. When she cuts her arm, I always gasp and just, I always feel for her when she's there.
Yeah, seeing that as a kid, and there is a bit of blood in this as well. I saw this before I saw Watership Down. And so I think that was possibly the first time I saw blood in a cartoon. And I found it really disturbing. Looking back on it yesterday, because when they're having the sword fight, the fact the swords are covered in blood, it's quite wild for a kid's film.
Oh yeah, and while the blood and gore is relatively tame compared to some things, the fact that it's in there at all is, as you say, wild. That's not something that gets acknowledged all that much. But kids have enough sophistication to handle that sort of content, and it's an argument I've made, and I'm pretty sure we evoked this when we were talking about Dark Crystal, that I believe it's necessary for children to be challenged by their media, and to present a sanitized view of the world is doing them no favors. Rather, to present the dangers of the world and also to present the consequences of those dangers in a safe environment, I think that does much more for a child's development as a functional human being than to essentially nerf the world.
Tell that to some of the parents now, though.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we could tell that to any parent of almost any generation. There's going to always be the tendency to think of the children.
When my son was about 5, his classmate he had, the mother wouldn't let them hear her son, and therefore if he came over to ours, watch SpongeBob. Because she was too violent. I'm like, SpongeBob? Yeah, there's a lot of that goes. So I don't know what she would have made of something like Secret of NIMH, or God forbid, Watership Down, which apparently recently had a lot of complaints to Netflix about that. So I'm like, this isn't a kid's film, it's a horror film. We were loving that shit when we were kids. They showed it at schools. it was the story they showed you to tell you about death. And not long after that, we got When the Wind Blows.
Oh, Lord. Oh, man. Great film, but devastating.
Playing that to somebody the other day, because they were thinking about whether to buy the restored version. They were like, oh, those old people look cute. I'm like, it's not a cute film. Seriously, believe me.
Would recommend getting that restored version, though. It's a beautiful film.
Beautiful film, but it's just, I think I must have been about 11 or 12, not a little kid. I think we were just going into senior school then, but God forbid. I talk about having an existential crisis when I walked away from that.
What's funny, kind of picking on that, is that there was no real consistency in terms of the content that my mother would or would not allow me to consume. I famously remember that she was always anti me watching G.I. Joe because it was so violent. Yet she had no problem with me watching the A-Team. So there's no consistency.
No one got hurt in the A-Team. They could land from the sky in a helicopter, which would blow up, and everyone would just get out.
Well, no one got hurt in G.I. Joe either, but something about it.
I love the A-Team though, but it was pure cartoon non-violence in that.
Yeah, I think she just had a thing for face.
Kids get crash that helicopter, smash that van, you'll never get hurt. It's fine, you just roll up inside, you'll be fine.
I mean, there was an episode where they were using watermelons to defeat the bad guys,
Like, what's that Under Siege film where they're actually using cheese in cannons?
Oh, wow. I don't know that
remember.
Bo, it's one of those Under Siege films. I'm sure they start firing bits of cheese or so. I remember watching it with my dad stoned. And
Was he stoned or you stoned?
We both were. Sorry, my parents are very responsible people.
I did really pay attention this time as far as the way that Justin keeps his hands clean, and so far as he stabs Jenner, but then it's like, okay, that's enough. We're done here kind of thing. Like you are defeated. But then when Jenner goes to, basically stab him in the back, that the death blow is dealt by Sullivan. Cause I'm always paying attention to how we get away with the bad guy being defeated while the good guy doesn't actually murder the bad guy. And there's almost always a wrought iron fence for the bad guy to fall on.
Or a series of vines to result in the very brutal death of Brian Blessed's character in Disney's Tarzan.
Yes. But here, I mean, Sullivan redeems himself basically by murdering Jenner, which I appreciate in that, that's the final thing that Sullivan does before he dies. It's like, okay, that's pretty cool.
It's interesting you bring that up, and something I never really thought about, that if you look at a lot of children's animation, the good guys do not kill. The villain is always undone by their own villainy. And in this case, he betrayed Sullivan. Sullivan redeemed himself by killing him and then died himself. But Justin was not allowed to deliver the death blow.
Interesting. Was I the only one who wanted him to get together with Mrs. Brisby? Or was that just a totally girl thing?
I don't know how that would work, the whole rat mouse thing, because I was wondering. There were a couple points.
Very carefully.
Maybe there's this crossbreed thing that prohibits it, and I don't know, it might be a bit weird. But I don't know. They had a bit of chemistry going, though.
Oh, they did. I mean, Justin is pretty dreamy. He's got that real, Robin Hood from the Disney Robin Hood look going on.
Yeah, totally. I wanted them to get together. I did think, maybe they're not allowed, but they're kind of from the same animal family. If
I don't
rats can
really want to think about it too much.
Do magic and
I'm sure somebody's written stories about it on the internet.
And steal electricity. I'm sure a rat and a mouse can get married.
Sure.
Is that a spark between us, or is that your amulet?
Oh dear.
Yeah, and I guess, with this being 1982, we are just about to Return of the Jedi, and we've already had 2 Star Wars films, so her grabbing that amulet and being able to move the stone and stuff, it's very the Force to me. It really reminded me of Yoda moving the X-Wing in Empire Strikes Back. I guess this movie really reminds me of Empire Strikes Back when I think about it, which is good because that's one of my favorite films.
Around the same time, I think.
I think 2 years earlier for Empire. But yeah, right around in the early 80s.
I saw it a little bit later on when they showed it in the school holidays. So it would have been around this same time. We were seeing a lot of dark things at that period. Everything was dark. We saw Popeye, that's really dark. We saw even the Muppet movies got moments of darkness.
Well, you mentioned E.T., and apparently they released this right before E.T. came out. It's like, thanks, guys. Way to fucking go.
Yeah, E.T. was one that really devastated me as well.
Did anybody expect E.T. to be the huge success that it was?
I don't think so.
The look of the E.T., who would imagine that children would be able to glom onto that weird-looking alien?
Still got my E.T. here, actually.
Sure.
I still got it. I was totally invested. They put E.T. on everything, which is, they had all the Star Wars merchandise, but that was the first time my brother had that. But that was the first time I was ever interested in any merchandise from a film, and they literally went mad. Every sweet, everything was E.T. themed, and I would just remember they had these biscuits that would dye green, E.T. biscuits. It was just insane, but I was totally into that.
Friend of the show, Chris Cummins, was just doing some sort of a sci-fi explosion or whatever. He does these different shows, and he was talking all about that book, Letters to E.T., where it was actual letters that kids wrote to E.T., and it was just fascinating to read because he reprinted some of those. It was like, wow, okay, this is interesting. And then, there's the apocryphal story of the whole idea of M&Ms refusing to let Spielberg use M&Ms in the movie, and then Reese's came in with Reese's Pieces and just blew up the market because it's like, oh yeah, no, who's gonna want our candy in this ugly looking alien movie? No way.
It was. I think it was because he was so ugly, though, that you really. I don't know. It's like the pug thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I could see that.
Well, yeah, and as ugly as he is, he still has that essential quality that makes it appealing to children that's also present within pugs, and it's certainly present within the character design of Mrs. Brisby. It's the large, expressive eyes. If you get the eyes right, children will be drawn to that. I think there was a study that's done, it was due to the development of our eyesight, that the first thing we learn to focus on is eyes. And that if we have large, expressive, cute eyes and things, it inspires empathy within us.
Well, E.T. was appealing enough that Michael Jackson was even involved with him for a while.
It's worth mentioning because, we talked about E.T. and we're obviously talking about Secret of NIMH, but dipping into that great repeating conversation and the debate of, was 1982 the best year for film?
I don't know. I still am a big fan of 1986 if I had to pick one.
That's fair. Though I will say Conan the Barbarian did come out in 1982, so that is slightly moving my preferences over.
There's the needle, huh? Between that and the Thing.
It was a pretty stacked year.
See, I don't know. I think 1930 was the best year, but, that's just me.
Well, people didn't know how to act back then. I read film Twitter.
See, there you go, Kat, bringing in knowledge and film history on us, man. I'm just supposed to wallow in 80s nostalgia, and here you are actually bringing a sophisticated commentary to this.
Fuck you guys. I'm going to go watch Stranger Things right now.
Come on, I had a row with some Spielberg haters the other week who were slagging E.T. off. And I think for whatever Spielberg did later on, that film was like, seeing it at the time as a kid on its release, and I know Mike did, it was like nothing we'd ever seen before, just like the original Star Wars were like nothing we'd ever seen before. I think it's really easy to take that for granted now. We've seen it all now. It's just kitsch and it's overly sentimental and whatever. But at the time, it was just pure magic because, and even NIMH was just pure magic because it's so different to the other things that were being made. It's easy to, if you came a generation after that and you're seeing it with all these other things that came afterwards, it's easier to be cynical about it, I think. But E.T. just totally blew my mind. So, Secret of NIMH did as well. It's one of the films that stayed with me from that time. It was amazing watching it back because I haven't seen it since I was a kid. The amount that I'd actually remembered. And I'm terrible remembering things in film, but the amount that had actually stayed with me in my memory was just incredible.
Well, two things I didn't remember was that Edie McClurg does a voice in here, but I think she just laughs. She doesn't even have a line. She's the Lady Crow at the end.
Oh, that's who that was. Though speaking of some of the other voice casts, I have to give a shout out to Hermione Baddeley, who Auntie Shrew, and I will always know her best as the maid from Mary Poppins.
Oh,
which was another huge film from my childhood.
I just talked about her recently because I did a commentary for Midnight Lace, and she has a small character in that. She's a barmaid in that, but she's had a succession of these sort of strange little maid or aunt or seem to be. And yeah, she was in Maud, which I didn't really know Maud because we didn't really get that one over here, but she was the maid in that, wasn't she? So she seemed delegated, but she's a great character actress.
I would be very curious to go back and watch Maude now because I remember being not necessarily scandalized by it, but it was so like, feminism and how dangerous kind of thing. And like Maude herself and then like Adrienne Barbeau with, I think she went braless in the show. Is that right? I just remember like being captivated by Adrienne Barbeau as the daughter.
Riffing off of Adrienne Barbeau and her connections to John Carpenter, one thing I had no idea until I was looking up is the voice of Mr. Aegis, Arthur Mallet, a celebrated character actor in his own right, but he also played the graveyard keeper in John Carpenter's Halloween. Why do they do it?
No way, I didn't really.
Same guy.
Who is also in Mary Poppins as well. Yeah,
exactly.
And what's his name? Toodles and Hook. But for me, I always thought that was, what's the guy's name? Bernard Hughes, the guy that played Mr. Merlin on TV and who was the Master Control. Was he the Master Control program in Tron as well?
Was he?
Yeah. Well, he was, no, he wasn't MCP. Sorry. He was there. He was worked with Tron and all those guys, but he looked like a sphinx almost. He was the old man in Tron.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I forgot that it's actually. I think it's David Warner as the voice of MCP, isn't it?
I think so. I know David Warner was the main villain, but I think they also used him as the voice of MCP.
I didn't remember that Paul Williams had a song in this. I didn't remember that he plays this out.
Paul Williams, though, he was literally the theme tune of everyone's childhood in the early 80s, wasn't he?
Well, yeah, between this and the Muppet movie, my God.
Everyone, I love him. Bugsy Malone. He did Bugsy Malone as well, didn't he?
He did, which I will secretly admit to you two and nobody else that's listening to this, I still have yet to see Bugsy Malone.
Jesus Christ, you're going to have to do a show on that one.
Yeah, Chris Dashu is obsessed with that movie. He keeps bringing it up because I think it blew his mind.
But it's so, you've got Jodie Foster, and I loved it as a kid, and I went back and watched it quite recently as an adult, and some of it is so inappropriate. You've got Jodie Foster, who's basically playing a prostitute. She's got this song in it called My Name is Tallulah, and she's 12, and all the dancers are burlesque, and they're all little kids, and I was just Jesus Christ.
What is it with young Jodie Foster playing prostitutes?
My name is Tallulah, and she's doing all these wiggles. It's just this is just so what were they thinking? It is amazing, and the songs are amazing in it as well. So yeah, you need to get on that one.
All right, will do. I will have to add it to the list, maybe in 2021.
Start the 2021 list already. You probably already have.
Yeah, I've seen your to-do list. Good God.
All right, guys, we're going to take a break and we'll be back with an interview with the producer of The Secret of NIMH, Gary Goldman, right after these brief messages.
Hi there, faithful Projection Booth listener, Chris Dashu here. If you're looking for even more deep dive film discussion, both old and new, on and off the cinematic beaten path, check out the Culture Cast. Every episode I'm joined by a different guest as we traverse the cinema landscape talking about not only our monthly theme, but also some of the year's biggest films. I'm even joined by the host of the Projection Booth, the one and only Mike White. So if you want to listen to even more conversations on film, head on over to culturecast.com or find it on all podcatchers, both Android and iOS.
I am thrilled to introduce Ovid.tv, the new streaming service for art house films, documentaries, and international cinema. Described by the New York Times as a haven for indie gems, Ovid.tv features films such as Claire Denis' Trouble Every Day, Deborah Granick's Stray Dog, and Raul Ruiz's Time Regained. As a special introductory offer for Projection Booth listeners, you can save 50% off the first 3 months of your subscription. Just head on over to ovid.tv. That's ovid.tv. Sign up with the coupon code PODCAST, and you'll get ovid.tv for just $3.50 per month for 3 months. The offer expires August 31st, so act now. You'll have access to hundreds of films not available on any other platform, which you can start streaming on all of your favorite devices, such as Apple TV and my personal favorite, the Roku. Once again, go over to ovid.tv, ovid.tv, sign up with the coupon code PODCAST, and you'll get ovid.tv for just $3.50 per month for 3 months. Act now.
Hey, do you like movies? Of course you do. You're listening to Mike White's phenomenal podcast, The Projection Booth. I'm here, however, to tell you about another movie-loving podcast, The Shameless Picture Show. My name is Michael Byers, and the show was created by myself and my good buddy in filmmaking, Nick Richards, in 2016 as a way for him and I to stay connected and to keep movies in our lives. Premise is simple. Each of us composed a list of shame filled with movies we've either missed, had no interest in, or just feel the other one should have seen. We've covered a wide range of films, from Heathers, The Godfather, The Exorcist, You're the Hunter from the Future, Phantom Tollbooth, a slew of amazing Vinegar Syndrome titles, and some that are not so good, plus our massive Rocky episode that features a new interview with Lloyd Kaufman himself talking about his friendship with John G. Avildsen. And I personally can't wait for you to hear us enjoying the fight to keep film culture alive. You can find our show on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, and, of course, SoundCloud.
I'm Dave Hunt, and I'm one of the co-hosts for Super True Stories, a podcast where two guys suffer through and report back on some of the worst documentaries you can stream for free.
And I'm Axel Kohagen, the other co-host. Film is a beautiful lie that teaches us about who we are on the inside. Dave and I look at the documentaries that are the ugliest of truths, teaching you about mixed martial arts and fishing, poorly faked ghost stories, and everything you wanted to know about core production values and stock footage.
Check us out on iTunes, Google Play, or at supertruestories.com.
What was the appeal of Secret of NIMH as far as being your first feature film production at Bluth?
This came to us basically from Ken Anderson, who was a high up in the artist areas of Disney. He was a famous guy among anybody there, and he wasn't one of the 9 old men, but he was a great character designer. He had been a layout on some of the best pictures that they did in those first 5 films, between starting with Snow White and Pinocchio and Bambi, and this guy was just a guy that you would listen to. And he had read a book called Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of NIMH. He had gone to Wooly Reitherman, who was our producer director, while we were working on Pete's Dragon. He had taken the book to Wooly. He pitched it to him, and Wooly said, "No. We've already done a mouse feature. We've got a mouse on our logos, and no, I'm not interested." And Ken was actually really upset when he came down to the first floor, and he went right to Don. He and Don had an experience on Pete's Dragon, setting everything up. Don was selected to be the director of the animation in Pete's Dragon. But when he came down to see Don, he brought the book with him, and he told that story that Wooly didn't want anything to do with it. And he said, "Listen, when you guys are in charge here, you must take this book and make a movie out of it. It's a great book." So Don took it, and then he called me from my office, and I came down there. He told me the story that Ken had just did a pitch with him, and felt really unsettled about the fact that Wooly Reitherman wasn't going to let him do this, I read it that one night, and I think I kept reading and finished it by about 3:00 in the morning because I couldn't put it down. So the next morning I went in and I took the book to Don, and I said, Don, you better start reading this. This is really good. And he said, well, I'll give it to John and see what he says, John Pomeroy. And John Pomeroy came back with the same ideas. Ken's right. It's really a good story, and it's going to be a good movie. So Don took it home, and he did his share of reading through it, and came back, and we were all just sort of giddy at that point, and we weren't even at the point that we were doing that. We were not thinking of leaving Disney at all. We were trying to make Disney better. We were upset, by the way, we loved the movies Snow White, Pinocchio, Bambi, Cinderella, and Dumbo, and even Frank Thomas, who I became an underling with him. I became his in-betweener, and when we went up to see Cinderella, and I came back down, I went, wow, that is just so emotional. He says, I think that's the best story we ever did with Cinderella. It blew me away when he said that, because I thought he would be more not interested, but to tell me that, Pinocchio was the best or Snow White was the best. And as storytelling, we never got past Snow White. But that's how we came up with The Secret of NIMH. We changed the title, but we knew when we were going in it was going to be a great project.
And how did you guys go about adapting it? What changes did you make to the book to bring it more into the animated realm?
Several things. There was so much of the two plots going on at the same time that we felt that we're not going to get this done in even 2 hours. It could be more than 2 hours to do the way that it was laid out in the book. And we had a bunch of kids working with us in Don's garage for about quite a while, like anywhere from 7 total years, doing 2 different projects. And these kids had all worked with us for at least 4.5 years on Banjo the Woodpile Cat, which was like a 27-minute project for theaters and TV. And it was on our own. But we asked the kids that came in there with us to read the book and give us their impression of what would be the best thing to handle here. Were we going to do it with Mrs. Brisby and the family, or is there going to be more about the rats? And the one person that we really appreciated was Carmen Oliver, who was the head of ink and paint for picking colors and mixing colors. When Dawn asked her about it, she said, "Well, I think it's all about the boy and the mother." And she's a single parent at this point. Her husband had died, and it was sort of a comment that it just picked up on what we thought about it anyway. But having her come to us that way, we decided we would do that, and so we pulled out a lot of things. There were a lot of fun things that were in what was going on in the rat's den, if you could put it that way, down underneath the farmer's house. We took a lot of stuff out that could have been really fun and entertaining in the film, but we went through that thing doing 2 pages a day. Don would go do the 2 pages, and then we'd have a critique every morning. It just sorted out, and at the same time in your head, or in Don's head, it actually is timing and how many. For each sequence you go into, or either chapter or whatever you want, how many minutes are we going to be in that chapter, and figuring out ways that we can move quickly but still get the information out to the audience. And that's the way we worked it as we went around. And once we did the first, 10 pages or so, and we had some dialogue, we were starting to looking for who we were going to put in there for our actors that are going to be the voices. And the first person that we actually got was it was Dom DeLuise that we selected. The 3 of us were all watching The End on TV at each of our homes. And after we saw the end of it, I started calling Don, and his phone was busy. Then I called John Pomeroy, and he said he didn't answer. It was busy as well. And for 40 minutes, I kept trying to call the 2 of them, And finally, I got through to Don, and I said, where you been? And, he says, I've been on the phone with John Pomeroy. And I said, well, I've been trying to call you. I've been watching this movie, The End, with Burt Reynolds and Dom DeLuise. And I think that he says, stop. He says, that's what we saw too. And we like Dom DeLuise as the Crow. And after we did at least one recording with him, he's recording the dialogue that Don wrote for it. And also there was another guy that was working with us, Will Finn. He wrote a lot of the dialogue for the Crow. But if you think about it, when we listened to it after the recordings, and we said, you know what? We need more of this. This character's a clown. This is the clown. This will be whenever anything is going down, and we can cut to a sequence that has got the Crow, it'll bring the audience back up. It's almost like when Bambi's mother gets killed, that the next sequence you're in the spring and Bambi's grown up a little bit, and it brings it back, and the music's saying the same thing, bringing the audience back and stop crying about the mother dying, I think the first two we got was Peter Strauss and Derek Jacobi, an English actor, and we had watched his series. I'm trying to think of his...
I, Claudius.
That's it. We'd seen that as well, and John Pomeroy's the one that said, why don't we get Derek in here? And same thing with John Carradine. Well, I love John Carradine in some of those older movies, We brought him in, and he was really interesting. I'll tell you a little story about that later. But Arthur Mallet, it was great. And Paul Shinar, and this guy was so good, and he died young. I think he was only 50 years old when he passed away. Hermione Baddeley, also another English actress, and she was great as the shrew, Auntie Shrew. Elizabeth Hartman, that came from, she'd had that movie, she won an Academy Award, A Patch of Blue. We loved that movie. We loved the way she talked and everything in it. We thought she'd be great for the mother. It just started picking up, and we didn't start with the opening, what you see in the opening of it. We went in and started recording characters acting together. You know what I mean? We're not they're both in the room at the same time, but the any two characters, we wanted to get. I think we started with a radio track. We call it a radio track of Mrs. Brisby meeting the Crow, and so that we had a thing that would see if we were getting the characters and their background, where they're coming from, and basically explain the character to the audience. With Jeremy. Jeremy's looking for a girl. He's looking to make a nest and have a family. And it was funny because one of our special effects animators, or an assistant animator, he was our model of what was going on, because if he was over at Don's house watching some TV while we were eating at lunch or something, he kept looking at, was handed on a Spanish program where there was a lot of pretty women on it and dancing and singing going on. And he almost put his hands out, like trying to grab, pretty girls, he liked pretty girls. And, Don kept thinking about that. He said, what he's doing here is probably what we have for the Crow. And that's how we would do each one of the characters, doing a kind of a background list of things that the characters might have been through and what they want to be. Almost like when you look back on your own life and what you're doing now, is this what you wanted to be? Or what kind of things you went through that were bad for you, that kind of thing. What causes them to be their character?
I'm very curious, when people are recording their audio tracks, do they have a picture of what their character looks like in front of them?
Not in front of them, but we bring several drawings of that character so they can see what the character looks like. And you know what? If you've really got a good actor and they've already read the script, so they know what's going on, and you can even read, their character by what they're saying. pretty much most of those actors that we used were pros. All of them were pros. We tried finding, when we were working on our little Banjo the Woodpile Cat thing, we would bring people in because we were paying for it all ourselves and we didn't have that much money. We were counting on these people to be ready to go. Of course, they've read all the lines before they actually came in. And each and every one of them, we did show them images of the drawings that had been created. Don, by the way, was the one. Don Bluth himself was the character designer for everything that was in The Secret of NIMH. And he's fast, so that whenever we went in, there might be 50 drawings of the character in different poses. And one of the biggest things you're really always careful of in animation is that your characters have to be appealing and interesting to look at. With somebody like John Carradine, when we met John Carradine, we did the recording at Paramount, and he showed up, and he was crippled. I mean, he was walking, but he was limping. And when we shook his hand was, his knuckles just were all swollen up. He had really bad arthritis, and we said, wow, that must be really uncomfortable. He says, this isn't that bad. My feet are worse. And he said, all my toes are curled up in the shoes. And it was a very, it was a really interesting the way he walked. And John Pomeroy was the one that would be doing the animation for the owl, and he threw that in there, remembering how he walked. So if you look at the movie and you'll see as when the owl decides to, told Mrs. Brisby what he wanted her to do, and he says he had to go, and he's going out to fly away. But if you look at him, he's limping on those feet that he's doing. And the same thing with the knuckles of their claws. It's all thinking about the actor itself.
Was there ever any fear that the movie might be too dark or intense for kids, especially with the animal experimentation? It
wasn't for us. We were thinking, what our experience at Disney, we kept feeling that, it seems to be, instead of like what Walt Disney did back in the 30s and 40s and 50s, he wasn't afraid to put in darkness in there. In fact, it's more interesting to have moments here and let people know, everybody's not good. There are bad people out there. We wanted the movie to be interesting for not only children, but for adults. We had a slogan on it it would be for the 8 to 80s. And when Aurora, the company that was financing us, when he opens up and there's a book there and Nicodemus is writing in the book and he's got these gnarly hands. And they came marching over to the studio and said, "What are you guys doing? That is the scariest thing I'd ever seen." And we said, "No, this. Don't worry about it. This will be fine," And they were just freaking out. And eventually, they bought it. And we asked that they get a PG rating. We need a PG rating. We got a lot of dark stuff in here. We want PG, and we got it. Then they suddenly went running back and said, "We need a G," to the people that watched the film and came up with a PG rating. And they got it. And we said, "Gosh, guys, we killed a character. We actually said the word damn in the movie, a cuss word. And we did it because we wanted a PG rating." And back then, when the critiques came out, it was we got really good critiques. And people were saying, it's too bad. It could be better if it was 8 or older for kids, and it should have been PG. It may have chased some people, afraid to bring their kids into the movie. But most of the ones that I saw or anybody else saw, even kids that were in with audiences, with their parents. There was a girl in Indianapolis, I'll never forget this, when it started up, about 15 minutes into the movie, I could see that they were getting up and going across a row, and they were backing up to go out. The little girl had to go to the bathroom. And they went across, they kept looking at the screen, and at the same time when they got out, they started to walk up, but they turned around, and as they walked up, they kept watching the screen. Then they stopped at the door and kept watching for another 10 or 90 seconds or so, and then she ran out the door, he went with her, and they were back in about a minute. It just blew me away. I said, that was probably a 6-year-old little girl. They were so fascinated with it. And everywhere I went when I was promoting the movie, I saw the same thing everywhere. Same thing with John Pomeroy. But John Pomeroy told me a story where he was sitting near the back of a theater, and the theater was 3/4 to full, and there were mostly adults, and adults even in their 60s and 70s, and he could hear them talking as they were watching the movie, saying, "This is amazing. I've never seen anything like it." We're very happy with the way it goes. And, right, even today, if I meet somebody and they don't know who I am, and they say, "What do you do for a living?" And I tell them, and they say, "Oh, well, what movies did you make?" And then I start making a list, and they said, just the first one I usually say is, I might say that I made, I worked on 6 movies at Disney, but then when I hit The Secret of NIMH, they go, "Oh my God, that's my favorite movie." Everyone, it always comes up, that's their favorite movie.
Going back to the adaptation, I'm very curious how the whole idea of magic and the amulet came about.
It's a way of telling the audience. It looks like he's giving her an ornament. You know what I mean? It was from her husband, from her husband, and he's telling her a mission here. I mean, what she needs is courage, because she's frightened, and she's even gone all the way to the owl to figure out, what do I do? My boy's got pneumonia, and I've got to move him to another place. The tractor's coming. I guess the magic of it is the owl and Nicodemus, because they know things, And so in that meeting where she meets with him, she tells him the story of her husband and how he helped them get out of the National Institute of Mental Health, NIMH, NIMH. And in that meeting, he talks about that amulet, and you have to have courage of the heart, and things will happen for you. So it was something that Don brought up, and I think it really worked. It really was exciting at the very end where she's rescuing her own children.
When it comes to NIMH, what kind of technical innovations, if any, did you do while that was going on?
The biggest things we were trying to do is put a lot of production values back into animation. We pushed and shoved a lot of special effects going on. Most of them were made up at that time, and Don would actually do drawings that would look like the effect he wanted to get. And then our supervising animator for special effects was George Lanfer, and he really guided everything through. He could pull things off and doing things that I'd never heard of, but I think there's been work before. He was a Disney animator as a special effects artist, and he had remembered all the things that he'd ever done with it. And any time that we gave him a challenge to bring something out, he came up with a lot of ideas about exposing backlit. They would do a animated scene, for instance, and there's sparkles and things going on. We used black paper, probably was called Exeter paper. It has a high gloss front and flat on the back, but we could actually transfer the paper that he did, which was on white paper, and burn it into this black paper, and then they would take an X-Acto blade and cut it open, and we have a light underneath the platen that would push the light through those holes, and they would be lots of designs in them, and you see the majority of that kind of thing going on when they're pulling that concrete little house that the concrete block that they were bringing out, and it was like things zooming everywhere. But we'd do multiple, backing the negative back up, say starting at a clear highlight, and then come back, start it again, and blur it, and then another one that would even be more, so it glowed. So we used an awful lot of backlight effects animation.
So is this like all in camera, or are you using like an optical printer for this?
we didn't have an optical printer, but what we did is we had this company called Mechanical Engineering or Mechanical, what is it called? Mechanical. It'll come to me. They did 2 multiplane camera stands for us. And they also, brought in the stop motion cameras. And eventually we even, in about 3 or 4 movies later, we were able to put everything on a computer so that we could, as we were adjusting everything for the X sheets for the cameramen, they would just set it up based on the X sheets. All of the camera moves that I was a big part of putting the moves on there so that they knew just how the movement's going to work. But eventually we could actually, I was going to say when we were in Ireland, probably on Land Before Time and also on All Dogs Go to Heaven, that we had finished up all of this extra ways of doing it with computers. I'm not talking about, the camera is still the camera, and we were still using film, but it was each time that they would click a frame, it would set up the next one automatically. You know what I'm saying? Using a computer.
Here you guys are kind of breaking from Disney a few years prior, but this is your first big, foray outside of Disney. And I'm curious, were they giving you any sort of attitude or maybe even trying to undermine you when it came to your project?
Well, they did. We didn't know at first, there was a thing that happened when we went in. It was on Don's 42nd birthday. We had envelopes in our hands, and people on the second floor saw us walking in. We were off on a hiatus because we'd worked really hard on Pete Stragan and on Small One, and we worked anywhere from 80 to 100 hours a week. And they weren't paying us overtime. They said you had to do at least 56 hours before you get to do overtime. I said, well, why don't you look at, I was talking with Ed Hansen, who was our production manager at that time. I said, we're working more than 46. I come in here at 6, so does Don, so does John Pomeroy, so that we're ready for the people working underneath us. We'll have stuff for their work that day or every day. He went away and he looked it up and he said, oh my gosh, and we ended up getting like 6 weeks with pay for Pete Stragan. And then after we finished the Small One, the same thing happened again. And we didn't even take it at the time because they wanted to get going on Fox and the Hound. So we worked on that. And eventually we said, let's go out and keep working on Banjo. And it was at the same time that the money was coming and from the Aurora people. And we came in, did our resignation, told Ed Hansen that we tried to make it better. He knows that we were very concerned about where it was, and it was starting to look cheaper. And we said, this is going to keep going. And each time we try to do something that makes it look better, you're not him, but people from upstairs were just saying, no, it's cost too much money to do it, and we've got to keep these costs down. Our motto was, we're going to challenge you. We're going to go out and show that it can be done, and maybe you come back. We want you to come back. When we left the building, or when I left the building, because they gave us, I think, 15 minutes or half an hour to leave the building. I went in and got my family photos and different things that was my personal belongings and was leaving. And as I walked out between the music building and the theater, I heard Ron Miller, hey, Gary. And I turned around, yeah. He said, good luck. I said, thanks, Ron. And I heard him say lower, you're going to need it. And that was a moment that I didn't hit me until I got past the guard shack, and I said, this is going to be interesting, And we didn't find out until, 4 or 5 years later that, it might be not more than that, less than that. It came from when we got set up with Rick Dyer, who brought us Dragon's Lair. I started taking on licensing in our company. And suddenly we had a ton of people coming in for licensing. And we'd say, I asked them, where were you when we were doing Secret of NIMH? He says, oh, Disney told us if we did any business with the Bluth, then they're not going to see another Mickey Mouse or anything in their licensing. And, they were very open about it. And I said, would you actually sign a letter to that effect? Oh, no, we still want to work with them, but you're doing a video game. They're not in the video business, game business, rather. So, yeah, there was a lot of issues with, apparently, that even with theaters were being told not to be dealing with us. So, and our problem with Secret of NIMH was David Begelman was the chairman of MGM UA, or MGM, excuse me. David Begelman was the chairman. I had gotten a call when we were getting really close to the end. We had been told by Aurora that they were able to go out and raise something like $4.2 million for AdPub promo, where you're doing promotion and also it's helping get the reels out it's actually giving the money to MGM. And in their deal with MGM was going to put up another, I think he had 4.2. They were going to put up another $2.3 million to try to sell this movie to the audiences, or to the theaters. Somewhere very close to being done, and long after it'd been months after the contract with MGM, I started getting calls from vice presidents at MGM, seniors and younger vice presidents who were leaving to go for another studio. And I said, well, what's going on? He says, well, they're not going to spend any of that money that they promised you guys. Hey, they've told us don't touch any of that money. In fact, I'm not interested in animation. The only people that knows how to sell animation is Disney. And so they didn't find this out until probably 6 months after the movie was done and in the theaters. And they came back, and I'm talking about the Aurora people, they came back and said, we did a $40,000 audit and found out that there's still something like $600,000 of our money still in the bank, and we never got any of their money towards the promotions. And mainly it's about TV, and they did some really strange approach to this. They called it a rollout campaign. So it started in West Coast, California, Oregon, Washington, Arizona, and Hawaii. And then the next week it would move the next couple of states over. And it took 6 weeks before it was across the whole country. And they had to actually really be careful about their promotions, or they're going to do advertising. You're just going to blow all of it and more of it. You would never get it. You wanted, if you could doing with the main TV channels, the big ones, then all the ancillary ones afterwards, it would be, if they would have just done it all at once. And we only had at the end, it was something like 670 theaters. 670 theaters. And we had good critiques, as I said before, but we didn't get a lot of promotion. We didn't. I went on, all three of us went out on the road and did TV interviews. We did television and newspaper and magazine. That went out, but you need television visual. So, you need to show them what's going on to get people to come in.
Was there ever any talk of adapting the other two NIMH books and making a sequel?
That was his daughter that wrote the second one. We don't do sequels, but it came up, and it was some time, I guess, before we came back to the States when we were in Ireland. We started talking about, what, maybe we should really think about another Secret of NIMH, a sequel to it. And then somebody brought up the fact that she had just finished a book on it. And then when we were recruited to come to Fox and help them build an animation studio, because Fox had animation going on, but it was in other people's studios and stuff. They would be financing and distributing stuff. When we got to Arizona here, we got a call from not Aurora, but it was somebody else. Oh, it was Aurora, but it was a different owner of the company. And he called and said, is there any chance you guys could do this sequel there at Fox. You know, have you guys started your movie, whatever movie you're going to do? And I said, no, actually. And so we called Bill Mechanic and told him that there's this opportunity to do a sequel. What would you think? Because they were not letting us get started on Anastasia. They didn't want us to get started until they had a script that they thought was perfect. And I just laughed and said, there's no such thing as a perfect script, you know. And it just blew me away. And we sat there for, let's see, I got here in August of 94, and we didn't get a green light until almost October of 95. And we had already had something like 240 people, and people were getting very upset. Somebody brought in a project that was sort of a big trailer it was going to be a video game based on Indian in the Cupboard, and it helped by, you know, not losing $15 million towards any money we needed to make the movie, the real movie we were doing. But it was a loss, a big loss. And in the end, I think I gave them a budget of something like $38 million to do the movie. It ended up to be $53 million, I think, at the end. It was because of that extra $15 million that we sat on while people were just getting salaries and coming to work, but nothing to do.
How long did it actually take to do the production of Secret of NIMH?
Yeah, I have a schedule of 30 months, and that would have put us in the theaters in August of 82, late August, just before school goes back. Aurora came roaring in and saying, you know, we need to get this done. And this was probably in March. They told us this, February or March. We want to put this out in 4th of July weekend. And we just screamed, you've got to be kidding us. There's tentpole studios coming out. We had, I think there was $600 million movies that I don't mean the negative cost was negative, but the audiences, you know, we're going to be lost in this. You will not get an audience, a big audience, when you got all these other things going. And that's the way it happens too. So we had to shorten everything at the end and race like mad to get it done. And we finished it up. I think it would have been probably 26 months, excuse me.
How was it for you actually sitting down at the premiere or wherever you see this for the first time with an audience and seeing your guys' work, see that first fully animated feature film that you had worked so hard on?
Well, we felt it was beautiful, you know, and we actually watched it at a theater that was right there on, I'm trying to think of what it's called. It's in Beverly Hills, so by the theaters are there. And that's where they put those big lights that go up into the sky. It was the only place all over. There was other theaters that had it, but they didn't have anything like that. And we went to see it at that theater, and we stood in the back. We didn't even go sit down. We stood at the back, and it had about, I'd say 80% filled. And people were talking about it as we stayed not in the theater, but we came out before everybody else came out and just stood to listen to what people were saying went out. And it was all really good reactions. We had actually, Jerry Goldsmith and I went to 2 of the theaters just to make sure that all the sound was perfect. Because when we walked in and they started playing it, we went, uh-oh. So we brought in a group of people that would technically make it work better. Most theaters, in those cases, bring in somebody to redo the matrix of what's going on with the surround sound. It was beautiful. I mean, that's the only place you're going to see it. There would be theaters all across the country that you might not have seen it as well as you would have seen it in those theaters that we did.
That Jerry Goldsmith score is so good. How did you guys end up working with him?
That's a funny story. So we wanted him. We knew we wanted him. And I found out who his agent was and called him about it. We were about, I don't know, halfway through, because you got to get somebody way before you're done. And So we talked to him, and we finally got to talk to him, and he was really interested in it. He says, let me see what I can do here. And he came back. The agent came back and said, how do you want to do this? And I said, well, I'd like Jerry to come out to our studio here, and we'll show him the movie, because there was rough animation, there was some cleanup, there was some storyboards still in there. It wasn't done yet. Even the storyboards weren't done yet. We were probably 65% into it, maybe 70. We said, would Jerry come out? And Jerry said, no, I don't want to go look at it. I'm going to send you my music editor. And the editor came over and he introduced himself, and we shook hands and we sat down and started it going. And he said, stop. I can hear Jerry's music. I said, well, yeah, we used a lot of stuff, his and other, mostly his stuff to show the emotion going on in any of those sequences. He says, well, let me call Jerry. And he called Jerry. He says, Jerry, you got to get over here. And he says, what's wrong? He says, because Jerry didn't want to see it with anything other than maybe sound effects and dialogue. And if not, maybe just dialogue. And his editor said, you got to get over here. This is the best mix I've ever seen of something that was a rough pass. So he came over, and he kind of fell in love with the whole thing. And I was lucky, I would be the one that would go to his house. The first time he started doing his key, he would actually play it on piano. And in those days, he just had his phone like I've got on my phone right now, a landline phone. And he would lay the phone down on his piano and play it and we would have it on a speaker with Don, John, and I listening to it, and it just gave you chills. And even when we went to England to do the recordings of it with the orchestra, and every time that it started up and for a rehearsal, the next one I would know that, and we all know it. But I'm a crier, and I would just tear when the music started going, and he'd stop it and then change things and make it better. And then go back, and let's go back to the top and start at the end, blah, blah, blah. And we were there for 2 weeks with him doing that. And, I still listen to it. I mean, I've got the CDs as well as the movie. But I don't look at the movie much. I think I saw it 4 or 5 years ago, but it went maybe 20 years before I'd seen it again.
How did Paul Williams get involved?
That was Jerry Goldsmith. We actually had one of our animators, a brother, was a musician, not just a musician. He was Glenn Campbell's, I don't know what the part of it is, but what did he do? He was like the music director for Glenn Campbell on TV. And he said, I can write you a song, lyrics and the music. And he did one, and we were in love with it. It was very similar to another artist that I'm trying to think his name. Know When to Hold 'Em.
Kenny Rogers.
Thank you very much. He had a beautiful movie, something like Keep Going On. It was really not a sad movie. Well, it was a sad movie, but it was creating an image of somebody who has to keep driving forward, for all the things that have happened to them. And he did it, but Jerry came in and says, I think I can do something better than that. And he wrote that. He wrote it, and he brought in the little man. It was interesting because he said, now he doesn't like his voice. He says, so I'm going to tell you something. I'm going to bring a bottle of vodka with me when I come in, because once I've had him have a few shots, he's game to sing. And I was like, wow. And so we said, whatever it takes. And I think he did it in less than 3 takes of his part, the lyrics, but it was his poetry, once he heard Jerry's music, it was really a great evening, and it didn't start until 9 or 10 at night, because they're busy during the day. So he says, I hope you don't mind, but we're night people.
You mentioned a little bit before Dragon Slayer, and I've always been curious how that project came to you.
We had finished The Secret of NIMH, and we had been working on East of the Sun, West of the Moon. And in the end of July of 1982 was the end of a contract for the union, the 843 cartoonist union. They did a strike. In the middle of it, not in the middle of it, but by, let's say, October, I get a call from a guy named Rick Dyer. And Rick Dyer is sort of a computer whiz, and he'd been working on an idea for an a arcade game. And he called, and he says, I just saw your movie, The Secret of NIMH, and I want you to come and join us and help me make this game. I said, well, okay, we can think about it. And he said, well, can I come? I'm going to come up there. He was down in San Diego. And he says, I want to come up there with a guy that has a distribution company for arcades. And I'd like to bring him and introduce you to him and see if we can get you guys to come on board to be partners with us. He shows up in a fancy sports car, and he's only 27 years old, I think, but he's done very well for himself. And he's been working on this, and it's like we're doing drawings that are on like a register, so that you just pull it through to see. And he said, but my guys are not what you guys do, and I really think we need something like what you're doing. And we were sitting there with a strike going on, and we had nobody there except us in the studio. A guy that was once a top cleanup artist at Disney was the head of the union for our union, and he came to the studio and actually came in and said, Gary, I'm going to have everybody leave this building. You guys can stay. The receptionist can stay. Your production manager can stay, but everybody here that are members of the union, they're going to have to leave. And they were all almost crying, got to leave, saying, those what you're looking at there, that's about the TV people. That's not about features. He says, no, everybody has, when on a strike, everybody has to support everybody else. He said, this shouldn't be too long. And it turned out to be 73 days long. So this thing came up, and I called the union and said, I want to bring a few of these people back because we're doing a video game, and there's nothing in the union about video games. And they agreed, so they let us do it. We did 3 video games. We did Dragon's Lair and Space Ace, and we had almost finished Dragon's Lair 2, Time Warp. And in March of '84, the distributor shut things down because he was already in Chapter 11, and we made enough money for him that he could have paid off all of his debts, but they didn't do it. And suddenly, weekly, I think we had something like $300,000 a week that we were paying. We had a huge crew working on that game. The check didn't come, and it wasn't going to come, and they were going to go into court. And so we had to find we had no money, and we found a bankruptcy attorney. Get this, his name was Moneymaker. That's his last name. We told him we don't have any money, because the money that we had when we should have gotten, we didn't get it. And he says, all right, well, we'll just figure out something here. So I gave him my pickup truck because his daughter needed a car to go to college. So that was our down payment. And it was this little Toyota pickup truck. And he was happy to take it and said, no, I'll get this started. And 4.5 years later, it came to fruition that we ended up owning all the stuff, but there was no money to come to us. So we were able to finish the last one in 1988, I think, 87 or 88, which was Dragon's Lair Time Warp.
Mr. Goldman, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate this.
Well, thank you for calling me. This is exciting. The fact that you've got a podcast, they're very interesting. I know that people really are interested in what goes on in the animation and live action film. So thank you.
We have a little secret. What? The most fun-filled movie of the year is only on video. The Secret of NIMH 2, Timmy to the Rescue.
Awesome!
It's the story of a young mouse named Timmy.
That's my boy.
Who thought no one needed him.
Fire!
Until the mice of Thorn Valley...
We might be in real danger.
...needed someone brave to save the day.
We're on a mission.
We've got to save my parents.
Let's go!
It's a magical tale.
You've got to have the courage to follow your heart.
It's a musical adventure.
One day I will show the world I'm my father's son.
And most of all...
Hold on!
It's high-flying fun.
What a ride!
So share the secret with your whole family. Make the most of your life! The Secret of NIMH 2, Timmy to the Rescue. Available only on video.
All right, we're back and we're talking about The Secret of NIMH. So I didn't really realize until starting to do research on this that there were actually 2 sequel books to this, which were Rasco and the Rats of NIMH, and then R.T. Margaret and the Rats of NIMH. So the Rats of NIMH is what we're going with as far as the titles all having the same thing in common. And those 2 sequels were written actually by the author's daughter. So kind of picking up the family business. And then I didn't realize either, sorry to kind of go off on a tangent, but Richard C. O'Brien, he did so many things that I have either seen or am familiar with, things like Z for Zachariah, and which I know was I think there was a TV movie on the BBC, and then there was just a recent adaptation with Chiwetel Ejiofor in it, and Chris Pine and Margot Robbie. So he's done a bunch of stuff. I actually ended up picking up a bunch of his books. What was that one? Like Report to the Committee? Or no, I can't remember what it was, but it's some interesting sci-fi work that he was doing.
Yeah, and I actually haven't read Z for Zachariah. I've read Mrs. Frisbee. I read that when I was in school. And I read The Silver Crown at some point, but I didn't read the later ones.
I was very surprised that he had done so many things. And so, yeah, and then reading about Rasco and the Rats of NIMH, I was like, okay, this is pretty cool. Cool idea. You know, we're going to pick up with Timothy and go off from there, or Timmy, and pick up from there. And he'll meet, you know, somebody who's related to one of the mice who was blown away, and we'll do all this kind of stuff. So there's like weird echoes of this that show up in Secret of NIMH 2, Timmy to the Rescue, but it's not an adaptation. And I'm like, well, you've already got something. Why don't you just go ahead and adapt that? Because whatever was written has to be much more successful than what they ended up doing.
Can I just say, I'm looking at your notes on Secret of NIMH 2, and most of the film, I didn't know what was going on. So I just kept zoning out. I just really couldn't pay attention to it, and those songs didn't help. Everyone had a fucking song. You had the obligatory jolly Caribbean sounding song by the peripheral characters. It was like a terrible, terrible poor man's Disney thing made for Nickelodeon or some cable TV channel. It was just, ugh.
We talked about how gorgeous the animation is in Secret of NIMH. What I did was I literally popped out the DVD and stuck in the other one. And it was like, oh my God, somebody took a dump on my television.
It's horrid. It's just so generic.
You know, I can understand. I mean, obviously the budget was not quite there, and the animation studio behind it was certainly not of the same quality of Don Bluth's crew, but you could try, right? I mean, you could at least try to do something of the higher quality instead of just going for the lowest common denominator. And I can understand from a certain standpoint, they're making something for kids. It doesn't necessarily have to be the greatest thing ever, but have a little bit of respect to what came before, right?
It reminded me, didn't they do a purely animated Stuart Little sequel? My kids were really into Stuart Little. And they did the 2 with the actual, you know, the live action, and I'm sure they did one that was completely animated, and that was just, ugh, what why have they done this? So we couldn't afford anyone or anything, so, we couldn't afford the actors, so we'll just draw it. And it's just like, no, this doesn't work at all.
So there's this bullshit prophecy about Timmy leading the mice of Nim to do something or other, and they're in Thorn Valley, and it's mostly rats, and we get a return of all of these characters that we know from the first movie, but I think only Dom DeLuise comes back to do a voice, and everybody else is new voices.
Arthur Mallet comes back.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I knew you would have my back on that.
I got you, bro.
Where are all these mice coming from? Are they all Mr. Aegis' kids?
Dude gets around. I mean, I could imagine that mice are naturally pretty fecund, and then you add in his enhanced lifespan. But sure, why not?
Sure, okay.
So was those mice he blew down the pipe in part 1, were some of those mice they had to rescue part of that pipe blowing thing?
The girl that ends up showing up in here, she is the descendant of one of the mice that gets blown away. But the math doesn't necessarily make sense to me, because they talk about, in the first movie, they say that it was 9 mice and 20 rats, and all but 2 of the mice blew away. So in my mind, that leaves 7 mice. And then they keep talking about the 6. And I was like, wait, are we missing a mouse somewhere here?
I don't know. Maybe one of them died.
Could be.
I don't know.
But yeah, Jenny, and every time he called out Jenny, we just were like channeling John Woo's The Killer, and we just call out Jenny every time. Because they call out Jenny's name a lot in this movie. And Jenny's the descendant of one of the smart rats as well.
Another J name.
It's the 2 brothers. It's Aaron and Moses. No, sorry. It's Timmy and Martin. And Timmy's been chosen for this prophecy, and then Martin's really mad about it. And then Martin somehow goes off and grows up into Eric Idle. How does that happen?
The same way that Timmy grows up to be Ralph Macchio?
The age difference in the voices, the Eric Idle's got the accent. I'm like, what the fuck is going on here?
But you forget he's crazy, and if he's going to be crazy, he has to be British. I'm just saying, I'm not endorsing this. I'm just saying American sensibilities. If you're British, you're evil.
That's true. I think the cat is inherently evil.
Wow, no, I'm not as evil as you two making me watch this terrible film, which I didn't know what was going on, and my dog kept barking at the songs, and at 3 a.m, and I was just like, I really need to look at my life choices, because what's going on here?
I will say straight out, I opted not to revisit this film because I unfortunately was subjected to it many, many times when I was growing up because, children, they latch on to films and they want to watch them over and over again. And sadly, this was one that my younger brother latched onto, along with the very terrible Land Before Time sequels. So,
I take it back. It was actually 11 mice, and so 2 were left. So that makes the math even worse. It's not 1 missing. It's actually like 3 missing. So,
well, maybe there were some nails at the bottom of that pipe, and 5 got impaled, Cannibal Holocaust style, and then the rest of them became the 6. I don't know.
Just picture these poor little mice with the nails sticking out of their mouth.
See, you want to go dark? Let's go dark.
Fucking Harvey Korman showing up in here as this crazy-eyed cat, and the woman who sounded like Wanda from Fairy Godparents, but it wasn't her. I was looking her up just to see if it was the same person doing the VO, but nope, different voice artist. But what the fuck, man? These 2 cats, and everybody's getting like their brains washed, and the people are acting like dogs. I'm just like, for fuck's sake. This is some twisted shit.
You're making it sound much better than it is.
Well, yeah. I mean, the reason why I'm not talking about the songs is because I had to fucking fast forward past them because they were so horrible.
I sat through them because I was watching it on streaming. I couldn't fast forward through them because my iPad was, so I had to endure those fucking songs. And literally one finishes and somebody says like a couple of lines and it's like, oh my God, they're going for another song.
Oh, yeah, way too many.
It's just like, no.
When they got to the song that the guy from Designing Women as the caterpillar, when he starts singing, I was just like, fuck this movie.
Obligatory jolly Caribbean sounding number.
Yes.
I blame the Little Mermaid for that one. Been in every shitty little made-for-video animation film ever since. Let's get a comedy peripheral character. Let's make it sound like the Caribbean. No. It had literally nothing to do with what was... Wow, nothing had anything to do with anything that was going on in that film, but even less.
The one thing that I appreciate at the end, when Timmy comes back and people are holding up signs that says, like, Tim is number one, and you can hear somebody on the audio track go, "You were there when we needed you."
Getting flashbacks here.
I mean, it looks like this movie was put together for just a couple bucks. I mean, it is just so fucking cheap looking and just so unwell thought out. Shame on the people behind this.
And yet a remarkably good voice cast, at least, I mean, not the work that they did in the film, but, you know, the rest of their filmography. You have William H. Macy in this cast.
Right.
They don't have Aldo Ray, though.
No, they do not have Aldo Ray. More's the pity.
Who I think might have passed away by that point. But, I mean, actually his character did, definitely.
That's okay. They could have digitized it or something.
I'm just wondering why they didn't bring back Will Wheaton in order to play Martin. I mean, he played him when he was a kid.
Or Shannon.
Yeah.
It was her character wasn't in it, though. But they could have. She could have been the witch from Charm.
There you are.
Had her own magical powers.
Or just bring her back to play the older Mrs. Brisby, you know? Have some continuity.
Oh, man, and Mrs. Brisby's looking so rough where they just, like, slap some gray paint on the top of her fur, and it's like, oh, you look nasty. You're right. They've got Peter MacNicol doing the voiceover. You mentioned Macchio. I mentioned Corman, Idol, Dom DeLuise. You've even got like Andrea Martin in here. I mean, it's just like, wow, this is a cast. What are you doing with these people?
I do think the film would have been improved if Peter MacNicol did his narration in the same accent he used in Ghostbusters 2. But then again, I just always want Peter MacNicol to do his performance from Ghostbusters 2.
I can't blame you.
I don't think even that could have saved it, though, to be honest.
I kind of also wish that Martin had been lobotomized at the end of the film, because he's like still a threat, you know, like if one of those helmets had fallen on his head and then like he lobotomized himself, because I'm just like, well, why are you trusting this guy now? Suddenly he's good?
The power of friendship and love. I don't know.
Oh, okay. So there's a third book out there, like I said, R.T. Margaret and the Rats of NIMH, and rather than attempt to adapt that at all, apparently there's supposed to be a computer animated Rats of NIMH reboot coming up, but they've been talking about that for the last 4 years, so we can hope that that's not happening, because there's really just no reason to reboot this or remake it.
No, I mean, the original more than stands up throughout the years, but, you know, I'll allow the possibility that it's always possible for them to actually do something of quality, but even if it's terrible, we can just simply say, go watch the one from 1982. It's still readily available, and it still more than holds up.
The thing is, it's not like we're going to get closer to the source material and make things better. You know, it's not like, oh, well, they really did a poor adaptation. Because, yeah, we talked about some differences between the book and the movie, but I think they were all like pretty good differences. There wasn't anything where it was just like, oh, wow, I really wish they had that. I really wish that they had talked about how they found a guy who used to make toys, and so he's got all of these little tools that are just the right size for the rats to use. That was actually a little bit of a stretch in the book, but like, had they found that in the movie, I think I would have been like, oh, come on.
Well, and all of the changes to the narrative from novel to screen, they had a narrative utility, and they were deliberate alterations that were made to refocus the story upon Mrs. Brisby, which I think was a very smart decision. I'm sure there might be people out there that absolutely love the book and think that it was an abomination, the alterations that were made. But for me, perhaps it's my bias insofar that I saw the film before I read the book, but they were satisfying changes, and both stories are satisfying in their own way, but I can't fault the film for the changes it made.
I think the original film's self-contained, though, isn't it? Even though you've got these little bits of mythology in the background, these little questions of, well, I don't think you need to know. I don't think it needs to be expanded. It's all about one woman trying to save her family. So I don't think it really works as sequels, because it's all about Mrs. Brisby and her struggle. So you get to part 2 and it's all about Timmy. We don't really know anything about Timmy. You just know he's this sick kid in the first part, but you don't really know anything about him. So it just, I don't know. It doesn't work, I don't think, as a sequel thing. Whereas The Dark Crystal would work moving on, because it's got more of a mythology attached, and we talked about that on that episode because the new Netflix one was coming up.
Mm-hmm.
But with this, though, it's self-contained. It doesn't need to be a franchise.
I totally agree. All right, we're going to take another break and play a preview for next week's show.
At the edge of oblivion.
And that our planet has just edged closer to the brink of World War III.
On the brink of destruction.
Enormous explosions in the distance have rocked the ground we're standing on.
The rapture has come.
We are receiving reports from all over the world, people simply vanishing into thin air.
And the Antichrist has arisen.
I am that I am.
Can a struggling man...
Oh, and you can tell your God, if he has something to say to me, he knows where I live.
And the woman he loves...
God, please show me what to do.
Survive the Great Tribulation.
You worship him or you die. That's your choice.
Cloud 10 Pictures proudly presents the groundbreaking drama, Apocalypse.
Welcome to an age of human enlightenment.
Shot on 6 continents, Apocalypse been called outstanding and soul-winning. And the soundtrack, featuring some of today's finest Christian artists, is praised as exceptional. Don't miss the movie that started it all. Apocalypse. Caught in the eye of the storm.
Next week, we'll be back with a rather special show where I'm talking about a quartet of Rapture films that are called the Apocalypse series. Until then, I want to thank this week's co-hosts, Kat and El Goro. El Goro, what's been happening with you, baby?
Some interesting things. We've been still doing a lot of Patreon selections from over on Talk Without Rhythm, where my Patreon supporters were booking the various episodes. It's led me down some interesting territory, whether it's talking about an interesting pairing of Scorsese's After Hours and Lynch's Blue Velvet, or down to some dipping into Kat's 1930s territory with a nice little double feature of Frank Capra films, Ladies of Leisure and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. So casting a wide net over there on Talk Without Rhythm.
And Kat, what's keeping you ever so busy?
The rest of this weekend, I'm going to be recording my commentary for the BFI's new upcoming release of Pier Paolo Pasolini's Salò. So that's going to be a different change in gear.
Oh, imagine so.
To this. So I took a break from watching sadistic films to come in and watch NIMH for a bit. But NIMH was more devastating. No, so I'm really looking forward to that, because this is like top 5 bucket list for me. And it is such an incredible film. It's just so... There's just so much to talk about, the history, Pasolini, even just analysing it. For a film that's like 2 hours, or nearly 2 hours, I'm going to be stretched to get it all in, which is always good. And talking of more classic filmmakers, but not pre-code, it was just announced Kino are doing a big Ida Lupino set, and I did a commentary. I recorded it quite a while ago now, actually, on The Bigamist, which is a very interesting film. So it's nice to see Ida Lupino being celebrated in such a fashion. I'm really excited about that.
The one thing I found about Salò that I think Secret of NIMH 2 really had was better songs.
Now I want to see Pasolini's take on The Secret of NIMH. I don't think the timelines line up, but in an alternate world, we would have had that.
The Rats of NIMH would have been Nazi officials. I don't even want to think about. I don't even want to mix those two things. Just don't.
But now it's in your head, and whilst you're recording this thing and working on it, it will be lurking there, waiting to come out.
Because we've always had the mention of bondage, so Right. Jeremy's backstory could have been a no, I don't know.
Well, thanks again, guys, for being on the show. Thanks to everybody for listening. Please head on over to our website, projectionboothpodcast.com, where you can find out more about today's episode. You'll also find a link over to our Patreon, where you can make a donation to the show. Every donation we get helps the Projection Booth take over the world.
Dream by night, wish by day, love begins this way. Loving starts when open hearts touch and stay. Sleep for now, dreaming's how lovers' lives are planned. Future songs and flying dreams, hand in hand. Love, it seems, made flying dreams so hearts could soar. Heaven sent these wings were meant to prove once more that love is the key. Love is the key. You and I touch the sky, the eagle and the dove. Nightingales, we keep our sails filled with love. And love, it seems, made flying dreams to bring you home to me. Love, it seems, made flying dreams so hearts could soar. Heaven sent these wings were meant to prove once more that love is the key. Love is the key. You and I touch the sky, the eagle and the dove. Nightingales, we keep our sails filled with love. Ever strong, our future song, to sing it must be free. Every part is from the heart, and love is still the key. And love, it seems, made flying dreams to bring you home to me.
If you enjoy this show and want more people to know about it, head on over to iTunes, leave a comment, and rate it 5 stars. Make sure you like and share us on Facebook, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter. Just search for Christopher Media. Thank you in advance for supporting Christopher Media by clicking on the PayPal button and by clicking through to all the sponsors who support ChristopherMedia.net. Most importantly, we would like to take the time to extend an extra special thanks to you. Christopher Media could not exist without your support. Thank you for visiting ChristopherMedia.net, and thank you for listening. Christopher Media. Let's make some noise.